So hi, thank you. Thank you for coming and joining us today. My name is Richard Neer. I'm a professor in the departments of art history and cinema and media studies, and I'm director of the Franke Institute for the Humanities. I'll be joined today by my colleague.
Larry Norman, delighted to see you. I'm in the Department of Romance Literatures and Languages, and I specialize in French literature. I'm also the chair of the department right now.
We're going to be talking today about a topic of contemporary relevance, but also, we hope, of historical interest, which is the emergence of arts academies and language academies in France in the middle part of the 17th century. A topic that's interesting not only for its impact on the history of art and literature over the last 400 years, but also, as we hope to get to, because of its relevance for contemporary relationships between the academy, something like the University of Chicago, say, and the art world and arts instruction. How the academy and the university, as a research institution, can play a role in and has historically played a role in arts production and arts practice. Um, what we thought we might do to begin is I should say that we're going to be conducting this really as a conversation. It's a dialogue between an historian of art and an historian of literature. And what we thought we would do is begin by just talking a little bit about how we came to work together on this topic and how we've been having this conversation for on and off for, I don't know, something like 10 years, and describe a little bit about how this came to be for us. So, with that in mind, I'm going to begin by asking Professor Norman, Larry, to talk a little bit about how he came to be interested in this topic.
Well, for me, working in the field of French 17th century literature, it's an obvious question because it was a period in which the Academy, the French Academy, which was founded in 1635, played such a central role. And we'll talk about that. It's the period of the regulation of literature and the arts, although much of it was self-regulation. And I want to turn quickly to how I met Richard in this regard, because as Richard has said, we work together both as scholars in terms of our fields of work, but also in terms of our institutional work at the university and the relationship between arts and the university.
But we should also say that Larry was one of the driving forces and was really instrumental in the construction of the Logan Center here at the University of Chicago. And maybe, Larry, you can say a little bit about that and how that's something that became not just an institutional project, but also a research topic as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this will again involve our collaboration. So in 2008, as the university was looking toward building what would become the Logan Center for the Arts, I was asked to serve as the first deputy provost for the arts. And this is partly, from some of my interests, partly that I had been an associate dean of the college and been working on this project a little bit before. And a group of faculty came to me and said, we really have to reflect on the major issues of what the practice of the arts will be at the University of Chicago in relationship to the disciplines that have existed here for so long, to think about some of the resistance that actually existed at a very text-centric university. It's changed quite a bit since then, but how we could be leaders in thinking about new forms of dynamic exchange between all of the different research and scholarly activities of the university and the equal amount of research that happens within the creation of arts, the production of arts.
Certainly at the University of Chicago, but also at a lot of research universities around America and elsewhere, arts practice has been understood to be something that is not necessarily part of what universities should be doing. And one of the things that Larry and I became interested in as we were collaborating on these projects was the deeper history of that situation. And Larry and I think became particularly interested in our shared love of the arts produced really in France in the later years of the 17th century, but also in the way in which we discovered that there was a deep connection between some of that material on the one hand and the day-to-day work of running a university that we found ourselves doing.
And so, thinking about that, Richard, I thought we might just say a few words about before the 17th century, right? Because this is an idea that goes back, and maybe I'll turn it to you for a second, because when I say Athens and Greece, I look immediately to Richard. But the academy was not originally an institution, a formal institution. Perhaps Richard can say a word about
Well,
that.
sure. The term academy just goes back to a spot where the philosopher Plato in the 300s BC found it convenient to have conversations essentially with people, and eventually it got a little bit of got some architecture, some buildings to go along with it as they got endowments from wealthy donors, as academies have been doing now for 2,300 years. But the term itself was actually initially associated with a particularly theoretical form of inquiry, an understanding of the life of the mind as being something that was really quite distinct from mechanical or physical forms of labor. Not to say that Plato and his philosophical associates didn't think that something like physical exercise or actual practical activity were important, but the academy itself was a place for reflection. A philosopher like Socrates should go into the marketplace, should go down to Piraeus, down to the ports of the city, in order to conduct the philosophy really in the street. It was an activity that one performed, but the academy for Plato was also a little bit of a refuge for that. A refuge from that, a place that was the really important point being distinct from manual practical activity. It's not a place where you learn how to carve or how to be an architect, things like that. It's a place for brain work.
Absolutely, and then this idea is, of course, revived in the particularly Italian Renaissance. This becomes a model for free reflection, separated actually particularly from theology and from the university, which had controlled learning for so long, and that model of the Socratic model, Plato, the great humanist philosophers, but also a playful idea of what that exchange is. And it was, in a sense, a kind of self-fashioning, we know, among an aristocratic or an elite group of people who enjoyed role-playing in that sense. But once again, I think that what Richard set up so well, this sort of ideal of free exchange, speculation, reflection, freedom, even playfulness, being, in a sense, institutionalizing itself, getting endowments, and being co-opted by the state is also the story, in part, of these Italian Renaissance academies, which could then become elements for the prestige of the local prince. And this happens, I think, first in the realm of learning, but also then pretty quickly in the realm of the arts. Richard wants to add a word on that.
No, exactly. I agree. So we have a situation in which one thing that Larry flagged that's really, really crucial is the extent to which in, say, the 1400s, 1500s in Western Europe, in Italy, in France, and elsewhere, in which what we would now today call scholarly inquiry and the universities as institutions were controlled by the church. So there's a tremendous pressure to develop alternative institutions, things that can be forums for any kind of intellectual work that is separate from the church. And just the term academy becomes something that gets used for an array of different formations, ranging from actual institutionalized structures with buildings and endowments and so on, and oftentimes patents from a royal authority, to informal gatherings of people in drawing rooms in private homes, where groups of people would get together on the third Monday of every month and have drinks and conversation. Those could be called academies, as could a much more formal institutionalized infrastructure, if I can put it that way, could also be an academy. So there's a lot of range in the term. And Larry, this might be a moment to talk about the foundation of the French Academy, the Académie Française, which exists to this very day, and how it came to be, and what role it really played in relationship to these longer term, deeper historical developments.
Great. Yes, absolutely. And the French Academy, I'll do the first of our deep dives. We'll see how deep they are, but was the first of the great official French academies to be founded afterwards, which is really the French Academy is dedicated to language, but originally to language, to literature, dramatic literature, to learning was its initial goal. And then it was somewhat more limited. And then additional academies were founded for the arts, for music, for sciences afterwards. So this is in 1635 under the reign of Louis XIII. And you had a group of writers. This is a time in which France was becoming increasingly powerful in Europe and had a great sense of self-confidence after the 30 Years' War, who were dedicated to a new modern forms of writing, those that were breaking from Renaissance traditions. And they met in people's houses. They moved from one house to another. But they knew that Richelieu, who was the prime minister, the Cardinal Richelieu of Louis XIII, was very interested in all forms of advancing French power, including soft power, that he was interested in advancing France not only as a great military predominance in Europe and internationally. So Richelieu, who you may know as the sort of perfidious prime minister in the Three Musketeers story, was busy building the navy as the colonial ambitions of France and Louisiana, Canada, and so on, busy building the economy of France, but also thinking about the French language as becoming the new Latin, the new language, universal language of Europe. And these writers went to Richelieu and said, hey, how about making us an official academy? And we will regulate the French language and we will regulate French literature. And in 1635, Richelieu agreed, and the academy was founded as an official institution. At first, it actually met, as Richard said, from one house to another. And then it was very soon given official place. And then it moved to the Louvre, the capital palace of Paris at the time, where other academies will also be located. And I want to now mention one of Richelieu's other great ambitions for advancing the soft power of France. And this was literature and theater. And at the time, this was the age of theater, where shortly, Shakespeare's been dead 20 years, just to put this in context, the golden age of theater in Spain. France was experiencing a theater gap. Other countries had great theaters. France didn't even have a purpose-built theater at the time. People performed in tennis courts, jeu de paume. And so he set about building in his official palace across from the Louvre the first purpose-built theater in France, which is where the official state theater of France, the Comédie Française, still is today. Moved a few meters, burned down a few times, and commissioned playwrights to develop plays that would be a success throughout Europe and would be printed and exert French cultural power. So two things that Richelieu is doing at the same time: advancing theater and the writing of theater, performance of theater, and regulating and advancing the French language. Now, through the Académie Française, these two collide at a crucial moment, and this is the center of my little anecdote. And that is at the very moment that the French Academy is founded, 1635, 1636, A young playwright who's making a name for himself but is still not at the top of the ladder, named Pierre Corneille, is working on a play based on the medieval story of the Cid, the great or not so wonderful Spanish general who led the fight against the Moors. This becomes an important early Renaissance romance, and Corneille is adapting it for the French stage. And it is released 2 years after the founding of the Academy, and it is the biggest theater success of the 17th century in France and probably in many ways in Europe. Certainly up there with the big successes of the late Shakespeare or Calderon or Lope de Vega. It was immediately attacked by the members of the Academy. Why? Because, first of all, it had poor grammar. It didn't meet the requirements of versification. It didn't meet the academic standards in terms of language. But beyond this, it also didn't meet the academic standards in terms of literary form. So the Academy was interested in regulating literary form according to certain classical ideals, which were inherited from Aristotle, from Horace and his art of poetry, which were reinterpreted in the Renaissance in the 16th century by learned humanists that tried to codify in many ways what a well-ordered, well-structured play or epic poem should be. And this particularly is incarnated in what are called the three unities: the unity of place, the unity of time, the unity of action. And it was found, Le Cid was found wanting in all of these areas. Finally, and this is perhaps, in a way the most important element, it was found wanting in its moral qualities, in its sense of decorum, propriety, and even, as I've suggested, fundamental moral characterization. Why? Because the princess of the story, Ximena, is in love with Rodrigo, the Cid, the man who killed her father. This was considered much too shocking. One of the main academicians of the time stated the case very clearly. This may be true historically, but all truths are not meant to be depicted on the stage, right? So you have the sense that the Academy wishes at this point at its foundation to really become a place in which literature is forged, regulated, censored, right? And Richelieu is a little concerned because he can see this kind of going off the rails in a sense. But the Academy then issues its only work of literary criticism, which are the sentiments of the Academy on Le Cid, which was meant to regulate the quarrel between Corneille, who's now become the star of French literature at the time, and the Academy. The end of this story is that Corneille says, basically, it is not up to an Academy to judge these questions. It is up to the people. It is up to the taste of the people. It is also not up to the state to judge these. He's quite clear about that. And in fact, afterwards, the Academy, the French Academy, in its regulation of literature, largely retreats to the simple and sole domain of language, of regulating the vocabulary and creating a dictionary, which still is constantly being reworked. It's the Académie Française, which creates the official dictionary of the French language, but also a grammar. It still had an ambition somewhere of writing a poetics, rules for poetry, but it just slowly abandons them. And what I want to take away from this is, in a sense, that while Corneille is fighting the Academy, he is extremely eager to get in, and he does get in. It is a site of prestige. It is a site of collegiality. But it's also understands that it has to place limits on its own power over the creative process. And in a sense, this period in which the Academy does play such a large role in the spirit of writers, almost all the great writers become members of the Academy, is also a period, as what I've suggested with Corneille saying it's not really your job to regulate literature, of an academic, anti-academic spirit at the same time. A strong anti-academic spirit that writers like Molière and Racine, the great French writers of the next generation, will display in saying constantly that what counts most in the judgment of literature is the pleasure that it gives the audience, not meeting rules established by any external formation. And so that's, I think one of the things is moving to Richard that I just highlight here also is that narrow domain in the sense that after its initial great ambitions for the arts that the Academy takes, it will become kind of a general supporter of literature, but will really stick in terms of its critiques simply to the use of language and not moral questions or even what we would call aesthetic questions, although that distinction between language and aesthetics is not always that easy. And Richard, I think the situation has a lot of similarities, but also differences in terms of the arts.
Well, one thing I think might be useful to see here. So we see almost it's very interesting to see it's a kind of it's almost an attempt at an overreach as you're describing on the part of the state, right? Where on the one hand, Richelieu, he's technically cardinal, but he's really the guy who's running France, sets up a body that is designed to regulate a public art form and a literary art form, that is to say theater. Something that's again performed before a large audience, which makes it a little tricky to control, but also something that is just written down, which is also a difficult thing to control. It's hard to control what people write. But what you're describing is almost a story of failure, where the attempt to clamp down on something like Corneille's play gets only sort of moderate success, and the play nonetheless, it can't really be controlled in the way that the state might actually have wanted. Let me ask you. So, what was in it? You've given some clue to this, but what was in it for somebody like Corneille or for the members of the Academy? I mean, if it's possible to produce your plays and be successful in the teeth of academic opposition, then why do people care? What does the Academy have to offer to writers?
Well, I think, and this will, I'm sure, be a constant question through the 20th century, but in the arts in the 17th century, prestige, social rank. Writers, there's a great, literature has its own history in terms of the role of the poet or the writer. There's, this great humanist tradition. The Renaissance elevated again the idea of princes, the prince of poets, a Homer, a Virgil. So there's this prestige, the laurels, this prestige of the poet. But in terms of social life, there was actually very little prestige accorded to writers, right? So it was a very imaginary kind of prestige and something you can pat yourself on the back while you're starving to death in your hovel. But where do you get both the material, economic support, and a lot of that in terms of theater came from actual staging, but it wasn't a big money maker. And the Academy brought that proximity to power and to patronage. So the Academy actually wasn't supporting the writers, but it was a wonderful sign to the state, which did sometimes outside of the Academy give pensions to writers, and to other aristocrats that this was a writer worthy of support. So I think that element, and as I say, one of the few ways in which the Academy contended to exert some power over literature, although somewhat limited, but more powerful, say before the 19th century, was its prizes. It gave prizes, and those didn't. Awards. Yes, exactly. It was an Academy Award. Thank you. And so I think that that's what was in it. And so even writers who were prickly, resisted power. La Fontaine, the writer of the Fables, one of the great French writers of the 17th century, had a very agitated at times relationship to the king, to political power, but he was still very eager to get into the Academy. And I'll turn it back to Richard because I'm very eager to hear how that relates.
The situation is a bit different in the visual arts for a couple of different reasons. One thing that's important to emphasize, just sort of in the background here, I think to what you were saying, Larry, as well, is the period from, let's say, the late 1500s to the late 1600s, that roughly 100 years, sees an absolute transformation in France. In the 1500s, in the late 1500s, France is in an appalling civil war based around conflict between Catholics and Protestants, but also really about the extent to which it will be a unified country at all. By the end of the 1600s, about 100 years later, France is a completely centralized state, centralized on Paris, with an absolute monarchy, personal rule by King Louis XIV, and is the most powerful state in Europe. And part of the process that we see here is the cultural, as you were saying, Larry, soft power aspect of that change, the emergence of France as a powerful absolutist state. And the attempt to have control over social life and cultural life, and to have develop a modus vivendi, a way of living for people to accommodate themselves to an emerging state power is part of our story here. In a way, there's a kind of dry run in the story that you've just told, Larry, in the development and the attempt to regulate theater and literature with the Academy. The story in the visual arts is a little bit different. In the late 16th century, or say circa 1600, France really has almost no painting or sculptural or visual art industry to speak of. Kings in the 1600s had imported artists from Italy, like physically bringing Leonardo da Vinci, for example, from Italy to France, but there wasn't really an indigenous French industry in painting or in sculpture. It had to be created by the state. What did exist was a traditional structure of what in the Middle Ages were basically called guilds or corporations in France, in French terms, where there were closed shops, basically closed associations of people who could produce paintings and sculptures according to the municipal laws of Paris. If you didn't belong to one of these corporations or guilds, or basically what we would now call unions, you couldn't practice in Paris. In what was now Paris itself, there were actually two competing such guilds. The area around Saint-Germain on what's now the left bank of Paris had its own little separate guild, and then there was the main thing for the rest of what was the city of Paris. The state in this situation wanted to foster and develop a local indigenous French visual arts tradition. But the problem was that there weren't really people to do it. What they wound up doing is sending French artists especially to Italy and to Rome, which was the great center for painting at the time, to learn how to become painters, to practice in France, and then to basically learn trade secrets, and then bring them back to France to practice there. The trouble that they encountered was that it proved very difficult to control those people once you had invested in them. So they would, and then also there were individuals who would go by their own means, to go and study and learn and develop careers in France. The French crown sent one artist named Simon Vouet. They sort of sponsored him to go to France. To go to Rome and to learn to practice, where he became very involved in the local Roman, basically painting guild, which was called the Academy, the Accademia di San Luca, the Academy of St. Luke, named after one of the authors of one of the four Gospels of Christianity, who was reputed to have painted a portrait of the Virgin Mary during her lifetime and was therefore the patron saint of painters. Vouet became very active and was indeed actually strangely the director of the French, of the Painting Academy, the Academy of St. Luke in Rome, and came back to Paris in 1627, bringing with him a lot of the styles and techniques of Italian painting. But there was no institution or infrastructure to kind of control him. He was able to develop patrons of his own, and existing under nominally under royal patronage, but for a period of about 20 years, Vouet was a kind of dominant figure, really, in the Parisian art scene, and was really a free agent in many ways. He was able to attract patrons of his own, and have a flourishing career without being controlled, really, by the crown that had actually sponsored his early development. At the same time, one thing that's sort of in the background of all of this is that painting was, in this period, still, because it's with a corporation, with a guild, it's still sort of on a level with trades, with things like being a wine merchant, or being a bricklayer, or being a leather worker. The corporation system, the guild system, works with all of those artisans who have a very powerful voice in Parisian society, and have traditionally had sort of privileges that come to them from time immemorial, and that are oftentimes they're often sort of pushing back on, or say pushing back on, attempts on the part of the crown, the state, to exert control or over them. Part of this long process of developing centralized authority in France. But painters starting in Italy and in elsewhere want to be more than that. They want to gather a kind of prestige that is better than what leather workers or wine merchants might have. They want a status closer to that of workers with words, what authors might have had. Larry has mentioned to us earlier about how wordsmiths, poets, could be drawn from all ranks of society. Dukes could write poems, kings could write poems, and poetry as a kind of verbal skill was something that cut across social boundaries. It was not something that was just associated with artisans. The crown tried a number of ways to work with painters. Poussin, who Larry mentioned earlier, is one person who made his way to Rome, not with royal patronage, but kind of on his own, and had become very famous in Rome by the late 1620s, 1630s. The king managed to try for many years to bring Poussin back to be a kind of counterweight to Vouet, and eventually succeeded in 1640, kind of convinced Poussin to come back from Rome, put him up literally in a palace in what's now the Tuileries Garden in France, and set him up, gave him a royal audience. The moment that he first met with Poussin, he said, "At last I've got that Vouet." He said, "Voilà, Vouet bien attrapé. Look, I've got Vouet's cornered now." And tried to set Poussin up as a kind of counterweight to that. The Cardinal de Richelieu actually died soon after, and there was a kind of shaky moment. Poussin said, look, I love my job here. It's great. I'm just going to go back to Rome and get my wife, if you don't mind. And at that moment, they said, fine, you can. He went back to Rome, and he never actually came back. So the attempt to kind of set up a counter Vouet failed at a very tricky moment in France. It wasn't until 1648 that the king and the successor to Richelieu, the Cardinal Mazarin, devised a different system. They basically worked with painters who were uncomfortable with, who were hampered by, whose professional ambitions sort of were larger than the artisanal corporations that controlled painting commissions in Paris. And they founded an academy, kind of learning, I think, from some of the mistakes that they had made with the literary academy, in 1648, headed by an ambitious young man named Charles Lebrun. And the key feature of this academy was that only members of this academy could get royal commissions. There was a absolute clear monetary, financial, economic incentive to being a member of the academy. At the same time, the academy existed, its whole point was that it wasn't the guild, right? It's not what those artisans, it's not what the bricklayers, the leather workers, the wine merchants have. This is an academy. And everybody knows that academy is for brain work. So it's something that brings an elevation in prestige, even as it's in essence an effort to break the back of the guild. It's a way to find alternative commissions to the guild. The most famous artist in France at this point is the elderly Simon Vouet, who's been there now for 21 years. He's not admitted to the academy when the academy is founded. He's kept out. It's all the ambitious young painters who have had their careers perhaps who've been bumping up against, on the one hand, the guilds, on the other hand, Vouet. And what the crown does is it says, we got a way we can work together, right? We'll give you credentials, we'll give you prestige, we'll give you commissions, and all you got to do is just break with that older medieval guild system. The trouble is what's happening in the late 1640s. What happens in 1648 in France, Larry?
1640. Oh, bad things. Civil war breaks out. Aristocrats, in particular, who are upset with the centralizing power of the monarchy, and it's a messy thing. The king has to flee Paris, for example.
Exactly. There's a huge civil war. Over in England, at just this time, there's a revolution, and the king is actually executed. And the Protestants take over. Oliver Cromwell has Charles I, decapitated. And over in France, there's an equivalent kind of huge civil unrest, initially led by some of the middle classes in Paris, but then joined by the nobility. And basically, there's the last gasp of resistance to exactly this centralization that we've been talking about. So the new academy, there's no real budget for it. It can't really meet. They continue to meet in people's houses. They try to develop rules. They try to develop things that you have to do to be a member of the academy. It works, but it doesn't work. People still get commissions. And it's not really until 1663 or 1660, in the early 1660s, that there's again a kind of closure to this period, this long period of unrest in France, as the young Louis XIV manages to seize personal power for himself, and to unify control of the state, not in having a powerful minister like Richelieu or Mazarin, as had been the case for the previous almost 40 years, but instead to rule personally himself, where the king is the guy who's actually in charge of the country. And it just so happens that at just that moment, the academy is refounded. And it's refounded with Lebrun firmly in charge, with its rights and prerogatives firmly laid out. And it starts to meet in ways that are much more recognizable to in an almost modern version of an academy. For example, they have seminars where they bring out paintings, and they have people who give talks. They give they'll give a presentation, much like we're doing now, about a painting, and an artist who's a member of the academy will talk about it, and they'll talk about whether it does or does not conform to rules, and then they'll have Q&A, and they have debate, and it's all written down, and records are kept. Then we actually have records of these academy seminars, which is very similar to what art historians do nowadays. We bring out paintings, we have slides because we don't actually have the actual painting, but we'll talk about it. And I'm going to put on screen now, if I can, an example of one of the kinds of pictures that gets talked about and the kind of debate that they have. Here's an example of one of the kinds of pictures that gets discussed in these academic seminars. This is a painting by Pusa, who, by the time the seminar occurred in the late 1660s, was already dead, but was being held up as the paragon of French classical art. The guy who, to remind you, had fled Paris as quickly as possible, precisely so he did not have to be a member of or kind of co-opted into the system. This is a picture of a story from the Bible that from the Old Testament, from the book of Exodus. The Israelites are wandering through the desert. They're starving, and God sends to them a miraculous food stuff called manna that falls down from the sky and feeds them. In the Bible, the Israelites go to sleep, and they wake up the next day, and there's all the manna that's fallen on the ground, and they eat it, and then later on there's a discussion that they have with Moses and Aaron all about it, and this painting posed a problem for the academy. And the problem was that there were certain rules that came from Aristotle, as Larry had mentioned, that had been promulgated by the French Academy with regard to theater and other forms of narrative art, that said that a good theatrical performance, a good theatrical play, will have what Aristotle called unity. It will have unity of time. It will all take place in a finite period, usually one day. It will have unity of action. There's only one story, and it will have unity of place. It will all take place in the same location. The problem with Poussin's picture of the manna was that it combined different moments from the story in the Bible. It didn't have unity. It was combining in one picture things that took place at different moments. So the people in the audience raised their hand and they said, "This is not a good painting. It doesn't have proper unity." And the fact is, honestly, it doesn't. But what you can see in Lebrun's answers to these debates is he finds all sorts of excuses for why it is that actually it has unity. It might not, fine, it doesn't have unity of time, he says, right? But it has a different, higher unity that's more important than the unity that's actually in the laws. It obeys the spirit of the law, if not the letter of the law. And therefore, you can have the important thing here is that the Academy promulgates rules. But it also promulgates, more importantly, what the exception to the rule is. And it can set up things as norms, as things that can be championed, but in a way, oftentimes, its authority is effectively arbitrary. Lebrun needs his founding father. He needs his Poussin. He needs a person who will be the paragon of French painting, which is what Poussin has been now for almost 400 years. But if the facts don't really fit that, then that's tough for the facts. What's interesting here is the way in which rules derived from literature get plopped down and imported into the visual arts. And Larry, maybe that's an opportunity for you to say something about the rules of literature and how they were promulgated in this same period.
Yeah, no, this is wonderful, and we've kind of come a full cycle back to Corneille and his play being critiqued by the Academy as not meeting classical rules, which were meant to have art meet an ideal standard and coherence. So they're a fundamentally intellectual approach to the arts, and I'm not trying to create an excessive dichotomy between this creativity and intellectual approach. But this brings me back, and I know we want to wrap up this section soon so we can open to the questions from our audience. In this discussion, it seems, I thought one way to think about this is sort of three interlinked elements that are in this dynamism in the 17th century and today. One is artistic and literary practice, right? And this has always, been a sort of a distinct realm, even in literature, because remember, the greatest poet for everyone through, in the 17th century, everyone would agree, is Homer. And Homer existed before there was philosophical reflection on literature or rules. Right? So there's an understanding of the creative process, which is in a way separate from philosophical, intellectual reflection. To a degree, one can understand this. And then the intellectual project of the Academy from Plato through the Renaissance. This ideal of what literature or art can accomplish. And then third, how this is both institutionalizes itself and is co-opted by the state. So political power and economic power, right? And it seems that those three interlinked, and I think we can never really detach each of them, forces, this creative force, this reflective, intellectual, critical force, and this political, economic force, are always in interplay in all. And I think your presentation just brought that out so well. This, the prestige, the movement from actually a guild structure. So that economic element is always there from the beginning, and the prestige associated with the liberal arts that the artists attempted to arise.
One thing that we're trying to get at here is the sort of the prehistory, how it came to be that things like art and literature should be academic in the first place. And one thing that we see is that it conferred specific advantages basically on the funding authorities on the one hand, which in this case are the state, and on the artists in question on the other. And emerging from that coincidence of interests, you have the emergence of institutions that can often be regulatory in nature. They regulate norms, they regulate what counts as good and what counts as bad, and they then produce academic art that can have many merits and can be in some cases the only way for people to actually conduct a viable career. It provides ways for people to express themselves. On the other hand, though, what we also see is that there are always things that are excluded from that, right? On the one hand, there were certain kinds of artists who could practice in the older guild structure, but who couldn't practice in the academy. A good example would be women. There were female artists who were active in Saint-Germain in Paris, producing usually kinds of art that didn't require you to look at naked models, so often still life and things like that. And those artists couldn't be members of a guild, couldn't be members, of the academy. You had to be a man. Very difficult if you're a Protestant. Some Protestants got in, but Protestants also wound up having a lot of trouble. And that's just within the category of painters. Then there's certain things that didn't count as being a liberal art of the sort that could even be a candidate for admission to the academy. You could be a painter, you could be a sculptor, but you couldn't be a printmaker. Printmaking didn't count. It was because prints are too cheap. They're mass produced. Printmaking, there was no academy, no place in the academy for printmaking. And these are things that we need to be alive to as we think about the establishment of academic arts. Again, there's a good side to it and there's a bad side to it. The good side is that it can provide funding and opportunities for people who are working in the arts. It can provide job security. It can provide support for art forms that might not have the ability to survive in any other environment. On the other hand, though, our arts often, in even our academies at the University of Chicago, can be exclusionary. There are certain kinds of things that are left out. There are certain art forms that we don't allow. We're, for example, we're fostering in multiple ways dance as something that often has a difficult place in its relationship to the arts because it's so bodily, it's so physical. Does it count as academic brain work? Is it or is it not? So there are, on the one hand, what the history of academicization tells us is some of the opportunities, some of the rationales behind the development of academies, but also some of the pitfalls. We had a situation in the 1600s where the most ambitious, the most exciting, the most forward-thinking artists wanted to be in the academy. They wanted to be academics, which is very different from the situation with, say, Cézanne or Van Gogh or Manet or Monet, or even a lot of artists now who I think would not like to be called academic art.
That's great. No, this is why, and I have so many, but I think now we will take questions and move and continue the discussion live. So on we go.
Thank you.